In our modern society, violent video games and controversy have been synonymous with each other since the rise of the very first shooter games like Doom and Contra. Because most popular games are violent, these games can negatively influence the behaviors in adolescents, since they lack the mental maturity to separate the actions in the gaming world and the real world. The exposure to violent video games can have negative effects to the adolescents' aggression levels by exposing them to mature content, stressing them out with the competitive game mechanics, and implementing characters with hyper-masculine traits. The violent content in these video games can increase aggression because to enjoy the video game, the players must be actively engaged with the game. The players would need to control the avatars on the screen, controlling what the characters do and say. This, in turn, would make the players subconsciously identify with the characters and the behaviors that the characters display. Since most violent video games have characters that display violent behaviors, the players would subconsciously identify with the violent traits and would imitate these traits in the real world. Even though there are regulations that display what age that the games are suitable to, many kids and parents bypass the regulations. A study by researchers Craig Anderson and Brad Bushman found that 59% of 4th grade girls and 73% of 4th grade boys reported that the games they play the most have mature content. This can have negative consequences because the adolescents would be more aggressive towards other people and at themselves because they lack the maturity to observe how the mature contents of these violent video games are just fiction. The multiplayer and competitive aspect of violent video games also cause increases in aggression. A research group did an experiment where they split the participants into 4 groups that play 4 different games to see whether or not competitiveness increases aggression. The 4 groups would play Call of Duty campaign that represent violent offline games, Call of Duty multiplayer that represent violent online games, Little Big Planet single player for non-violent offline games, and Little Big Planet multiplayer for non-violent online games. Then they would be filling out a survey that measures how angry they were when playing the games. The results show that the group that plays the violent online game had the highest level of aggression. This is because when the players are involved in a multiplayer game, they are exposed to other players that can anger them by trolling, griefing, or verbal harassment. Since most popular violent video games revolves around the multiplayer aspect, more adolescent teens are playing multiplayer games than before, and because the adolescent's mind lack the skills to self-control their emotions when confronted with abusive people, they would be more aggressive to others. Stress is another factor that makes people more aggressive when playing a violent video game. Stress is the body's reaction to physical danger. Normally, stress would result in an increase in heart rate, muscle twitch, and aggression. Violent video games are often the most stressful, since the players are constantly bombarded with virtual dangers that the brain recognizes as real threats, even though these threats are not real. Since the brain cannot differentiate the virtual threats from the real threats, the brain would force the body into fight mode and increase aggressive behaviors. For adolescents, since the brains are still developing, the immense stress from these violent video games can increase their aggression even more than the adults, since they lack the maturity to handle the stress. Also, in most violent video games, there are characters that display hyper-masculine traits like being muscularly big and being dominant towards other people. Most modern games like Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto 5, and many others have male characters that display overtly violent behaviors and females characters that display overtly sexual behaviors. If these teenagers are exposed to hyper-masculine characters on a daily basis, they would eventually imitate some of the behaviors that these video game characters have. The players would be more aggressive towards other people, since they want to be more dominant, and would believe that all women are sexual objects from the constant exposure to the overly sexualized women in these games. Because the teenager's brain is still developing, they could subconsciously inherit these hyper-masculine traits from these video game characters. In conclusion, violent video games increase aggressive behaviors in adolescents by exposing them to mature content, stressing the players with the game's competitive mechanics, and implementing hyper-masculine characters that the adolescents could identify with. Since video games are the most engaging types of entertainment, it is up to the manufacturers of these games to paint what type of future they want society to be. If they keep publishing violent games and not regulate the content of these games, then there would be a future where aggression is the primary emotion and violence is an everyday part of life. Thank you for watching.